Woohoo, yeah, all right. Something new has been added. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to Media Academy Online. If you've been watching this channel for a while now, you know that we're always talking about game development and film production. And we're always talking about it, but we never really get our hands dirty and focus on the practical side of things. So in this video, we're going to change that. I've been working in the film production industry for over 10 years. I work on a number of films and I spend a lot of my time nowadays working on TV commercials for large national brands. But I didn't always start out that way. I started out just like anyone else did. So that's why in this video, I'm starting a new series that is focused on using old and cheap technology. And with this technology, I've got a single goal: try and make it look as great as I can. And with this series, I'm setting out to prove a point that you don't need the biggest and best technology to be able to make film. So without further ado, let's begin this video, and we're going to start with my very first camera. All right, this is it. It is the Handycam, it is Sony Handycam camera from 2008. I bought it when it came out in 2008. It was my very first camera. So let's begin by talking a little bit about this camera. So this camera is part of the Handycam range, which was a very popular range by Sony, which really is focused on the consumer grade people. When this came out, majority of people were using cameras like this just to film family events, things like that. And so this camera fitted right down in the bottom end of that range. It was super cheap. I bought it for 350 Australian dollars. I bought it myself, and I made a lot of my very first films with this. This is my first starting out point as a filmmaker. So this camera, its exact name is DCR-HC52E. It is what it looks like. It's a small camera, all built into one. So this was really the way to go. Now we've got new technology with interchangeable lenses and these DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras and all this fancy stuff. This was really back then the only way you could do it. If we start going through this list, we can see the first thing is stereo sound. There is no input on this, so what the sound is what you get. When I made my own films, I never used the sound. I pretty much would record and then put in sound after the fact. Of course, you know, it's not the best way of doing things, but that's how I had to work with this camera. So that meant there wasn't really any big dialogue scenes or anything like that. But I made it work for the films that I did. So it is a recording format is DV. So these guys take what are known as mini DV tapes, and I'll go through that in a minute. Now this screen is a whopping 2.5 inches. So that is a ginormous screen. The biggest screen you'll ever see. Actually, something that is very impressive for a camera this size is it's got 40 times optical zoom. So that's pretty good, especially for cameras around this price range at this time. It's got 2000 times digital zoom. Now, we all know that digital zoom is pointless. So if you ever think about using digital zoom, no, that is not a way to go. And so there's some of the specs. So let's start having a play, shall we? So I actually haven't turned this on for many years, and the only reason why I've held on to it is because I've got a huge collection of mini DV tapes, and this is the only way of me capturing those tapes onto the computer. When I first started out, we were still using DV tapes, mini DV tapes. So this camera's purpose for me is if those clients ever needed that footage, this is the only way I can capture it. Even high-end professional cameras used mini DV tapes when I started out, so that's why I'm holding on to the tapes. Actually, let me show you. Right. This is my collection of mini DV tapes. It, as you can see, it's full to the brim of mini DV tapes. There is a number of them. So if you started using films after a certain point, you would not know what these are. But these guys were the only way of recording digital format video at the time. SD cards weren't fast enough, and we just didn't have the technology to be able to record onto cards like we do today. This was the only way, and now these guys use a magnetic strip and record straight onto the tape. This is going to bring back some memories, but this always has a specific sound and I hope the camera picks it up when you open it. And it's something that's become very beloved, just because I used to hear it all the time growing up. Yep, it sounds the same. That is great. And effectively the tape just goes straight in the slot and you close it. Now once that's in place, you can effectively open it. Now turning it on, there's a nice little flick here, so that still feels really nice to the hand. And this screen has really aged. It is really small. It's 4:3, so it's a really odd ratio. Back then that was the set ratio for a lot of these cameras. Even TV was still using that format for some shows. So now as I turn it on, it automatically says 2008. Obviously we're not in 2008 anymore, so let's take it all the way forward in time to 2020. And now we're ready to go. This was actually very handy to have. It's got a built-in lens cap, so that can just click open and we're ready to go. So let's begin by going through some of the features and see if any of this is usable. It's got a touch screen, so that element is still, you know, pretty modern. So, and we can begin by going to, there's guide and there's FN, which I believe is function. So if I click that, now we have our settings. We've got a few settings here. We've got a focus setting, spot meter, we've got display guide, menu, and something that's going to come in very handy is exposure. So we've got automatic exposure and manual exposure. So that might come in very handy when trying to make a film with this. If I go to page 2, we've got white balance, which is sort of stuck there randomly, which doesn't really have too much functionality by the looks of it. Outdoor, indoor, and one push. So I don't know what I can do with that, but those settings are there anyway. It is changed to 16:9, so hopefully it'll record as 16:9 natively on this. But on my display, it's actually just put black bars on the top and bottom of the image. So we'll see how that goes. Other than that seems to be all the functionality. Looking around, we've got easy battery display, which hides or removes the display. And other than that, there isn't much else. As I said, you can't put in any external audio. What you see is what you get. So I won't be using any audio for this. If you wanted to do audio with this camera, you'd have to do it separately. But obviously, this is getting on a pretty old camera now, 2008. And what can you expect for $350 back then? So this is what you get. The thing with this camera though is when you're recording, it works like a VHS tape does. So there's a beginning and an end of the tape, and you can record at any stage between that tape. If it's not a blank tape, you're going to record over what is currently at that time. So it's like a timeline, and it'll just record over whatever is on that tape. I don't know what's on this tape. Don't think it's important. And this is what I want to do. I want to rewind to the beginning of the tape. Oh. That's rewinded it back, and we should be good to go. If I flick this mode again, we should be able to take it back to camera. So I'm just going to record myself to see low light. It looks pretty terrible in low light. We'll get it in the computer later and see for certain, but that looks pretty grainy. Zoom looks terrible. It looks like it would. You tend not to want to use zoom during a take anyway. So if you're going to set this up, it's got a 40x optical zoom. Don't use digital zoom ever. If you do, you're going to get a terrible image. So never use digital zoom, but that can zoom in pretty far. That is some pretty impressive distance. Now it's moved into digital zoom territory. You see the further I zoom out, and the shake is very noticeable the more you zoom in. So if I zoom in on myself, you can start to see that's really getting shaky now. But when I zoom out, you can see the change from digital to optical. It smooths out pretty quick. And if I go full out, that is pretty impressive in terms of, you know, the amount of shake we're getting. At least on this camera, we'll see for certain when I record the footage onto the computer. But that seems pretty good for one-handed. I'll set it up and make it face me. We'll see how it compares to a Blackmagic 4K, which I'm recording this on, and this camera here, to see what the difference is. This is the difference. So Blackmagic, Sony Handycam. As you can see, there's a bit of a stark difference, but what do you expect for a camera that in Australia cost $2,300 without a lens? with this little camera here from 2008 that has everything you need ready to go, that is 350 bucks. So that's the difference. That's what you're going to get. But I haven't given up on the little fella yet. So me and Brandon are going to go outside and we're actually going to shoot with this camera and see if we can make some pretty impressive shots even with this camera. So we've gone outside now. We're going to play with this camera and see what we can actually create. Now, this camera, as I said, it's got no internal audio, so we're going without audio. That will have to get added in post. It does have 40 times optical zoom, but I think for the majority of it, I'm going to cheat and I'm actually going to use the stabilizer. So I know that's kind of going against what I'm trying to do here, but I'm just trying to prove a point about image quality. So that's the main thing. But really you could set this up with anything. You could use a rig, you could use a shoulder mount, you could use, I'm using a gimbal, so I'm cheating a little bit, but again, as I said, you can use anything, so it doesn't really matter. The point is, we're just going to see if I can make something decent out of this camera. Right, so I've set it up on the Ronin S at the moment, which looks pretty hilarious. Obviously the Ronin S is built for much higher end cameras, and it's the exact one that I use on my Blackmagic 4K. Hey, it works, so we'll see how it goes. The good thing about it is that because this isn't a separate lens and it's all built in, I can actually use zoom without worrying about knocking off the weight. I didn't have to do too much about the balancing either because it is so light. It was pretty easy to set up, and look, that's pretty solid to me. But now I'm going to run over and try and get some nice shots of this bridge, and I guess we'll see what we can do. So this is going to be very interesting to see how this color comes out, because as you can see by this camera, it's quite a vibrant image. So this is probably a great test to see how this handles color. So the sensors that got used back at around this time were CMOS sensors. Now this is a poor man's version of a CMOS sensor, so it's built similar, but it's not exactly the same. So it's going to be very interesting to see how those sensors do work, these old vintage sensors. Don't know if I got anything there, but cool. Funny thing with this camera that I've just noticed is that the dynamic range is shocking. I'm trying to now quickly film some of this platform here and some of the water, and all of these poles are just black. So obviously it's not built with many stops within it. Obviously it's not built for filmmaking full stop, but just seeing the difference in technology now that we have and the amount of information we can get in these new cameras, it's pretty interesting to see just the difference between a camera like what we're filming now and this one. So, but I'll keep going and we'll see what else we can do. So this is probably a good shot to play around with the zoom. I'm quite far away from Brandon, but I might actually turn around and film him. So there he is. And we can see it's coming up pretty good. So that's that 40 times optical zoom coming into play. Obviously with this kind of camera, with this kind of lens, it works differently to what we're used to with the normal lenses you use with a DSLR or mirrorless kind of camera. This one here works very different, and it's all built in, and it's rather than using what we're used to, it just zooms in. You can't change the lens, you can't really do anything, but we do have 40 times optical zoom. Again, it's got 2000 times digital zoom. Never use digital zoom, it is shocking, it is terrible. Again, it's interesting to see the refraction on his top there that we're getting with this camera. The shaking's not too bad, there's a little bit of shake. Again, it's on the gimbal, so we're kind of cheating a little bit here. There's that dynamic range showing on his face there. So Brandon is just one side is really dark and one side is just blown out. We can't see what's going on. So it's very interesting to see how technology has evolved. So I've had to play with this camera. It's really rewound the clock for me, brought back a lot of memories. But now looking at it as a professional filmmaker, it's interesting to see the difference that, first of all, the lack of control. It's got, I guess you could call it white balance control, but it's not really. You've got auto, you've got outside, inside, and that was about it really. There's really not much control that you've got with this white balance. There is manual exposure, which I used. Really, I'd want to control that exposure as much as I can, and that's what I did as best I can. You can create some effects. You can get some bokeh involved with this, so that shallow depth of field is possible, but you have to stand right back, which is fine. That's a good trick for a lot of people using cheaper equipment. An easy way of getting that effect is making sure that you're back as far as you can go and you're using that optical zoom as far forward as you can, and that'll create that same shallow depth of field. I wouldn't use this handheld though. If you were ever going to use it in a project, always have it on a tripod, and that's a good rule with any cheaper equipment, DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, any camera really. If you can, put it on a tripod. The problem that we have with these lighter technologies is that they are light, and that it's easy to create shake or jitter within the cameras. So easy solution to that is always make sure there's some sort of weight on it. So you don't need to worry if you don't have a fancy gimbal like this. You can still do it just even by having a tripod to give it that weight. Really what you want to try and do is add weight to the camera, but also make sure the weight is furthest down to the bottom point as possible. So usually tripods will be heavier than that camera, and that will bring that weight down to as low as you can, to the lowest point. This is using tape. We really have to press start stop, and if you want to watch back at that stuff you have to rewind it, so it's quite old school. But having said that, it effectively works very similar to any other digital camera does. So you press record and it records. So that's been fine. There hasn't really been too much of issues. Again, it's got a touch screen, which is lovely. It's nice. Even for when I had it, it was kind of a new thing back then to have those touch screens. A lot of cameras back then were actually, you'd have little joysticks or you'd have to use buttons. So it's nice that that option's there. Other than that, I guess the biggest issues, if we'll run through the problems that I had, so the dynamic range is shocking. That's probably the biggest issue. And everything else you could probably get away with. It's just really that dynamic range that it's killed it. The amount of stops of light that it handles, and that's just because of the technology of the time wasn't built to handle that. Yes, you could get higher end cameras that could do a better job, but for a camera that's $350, I mean, that's what you're kind of expecting. So it's going to be fun to try and see if I can counteract that in post, but we'll see how we go with that. Again, grain, I'm in a day, it's actually a perfect day for filming. Overcast days are really good because it minimizes shadows, and for, as I mentioned before, stops of range, it means that it's a bit easier to handle that kind of thing because there's less light, less light differences. Again, a little bit of issues I had when I was filming with the reflection in the water. That's expected because there is quite a lot of light that gets reflected from the water. Other than that, it worked as expected. It's nice to have that zoom built into the camera so that I could easily change the zoom while I was filming. If I was to do this with a modern day camera, with a lens added to it, I would have to rebalance every time I wanted to change that zoom, but because of the zoom is built in, I didn't have that issue. Other than that, we'll go back, we'll capture this footage. So we're not copying this footage, we're capturing it, and I'll talk about that later. But other than that, we'll capture the footage. I guess we'll try and make it look as best as we can. So I began by plugging it into the computer. I had to use a special cord, which I've held onto, a Firewire 800 cable. Luckily, I still have my computer, which I've been holding onto from 2009, which still has an input for this cable. Then I was able to go to Premiere Pro and go to the capture settings. And I was able to capture the footage in real time. This meant rewinding the tape and pressing record and letting it play the whole video from beginning to end. Now this is where I began editing the footage. I began by blowing it up to 1080p to make it more of a modern standard. And yes, this could potentially mean that I'm going to have a slightly blurry image, but I was willing to take that gamble in the hope I can clean it up later on. I then used warp stabilizer to remove some of that jitter that was still getting picked up by the camera. And even though it was on a gimbal, it still managed to pick up a few shakes. From here, I had to do something about this horrible grain that was appearing everywhere in my footage. So I was able to put this into After Effects, and just like removing a veil, I was able to remove this grain. Then I was able to see a bit more of what was originally captured, with some of this grain getting removed. It was interesting to see the difference that this actually made in some shots. In some high contrast shots, like this bridge, we still had some horrible lines appear on the edges, but there's not much I can do about this. Once that was done, it was time to color grade it to try and bring those colors out a bit more. So it wasn't such a flat image like what we began with. In order to hide some of these strange artifacts that were still persistent in our footage, the only way I could think about covering this is by adding in some film grain. This allowed us to add an effect overlay over the top of it, which was able to hide just a little bit some of this strange artifacts that were appearing in the footage. And once I'd put all of those steps together, we ended up with footage like this. Here is the footage both cleaned up, then with that grain applied after the fact. Make sure you let us know in the comments whether you liked it with the grain or not. So that was the Sony Handycam from 2008, which was just a revamped version from the original, which was from 2005. It just goes to show you how far technology actually has evolved. A small standard definition camera like this one, terrible in low light situations, it's got no audio input, it's got nothing. But when I was growing up, this was the only way of creating the films you wanted to create. And so this was my go-to tool. Whenever I had some spare time, I would pull it out and I'd make whatever film I could make. Being able just to have a small camera like this and make films, even though they never looked amazing, it just goes to show you what you guys can do now with even a phone. A phone craps all over this camera. Now technology is so cheap, you don't have to make a film with a $350 Handycam camera. You can use anything. You can use your phone, you can use a DSLR, mirrorless, you can use more high-end stuff like this Blackmagic camera. Even though this was a fun exercise to try, and you can clearly see the change in technology now and the difference in quality, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what camera you're using. It doesn't matter the tools. It doesn't matter if you've got the latest and greatest technology. All that matters is that you've got a story to tell and you're willing to try and tell it. So what are you waiting for? Go out there, create a story with whatever camera you can. If I could do it in 2008 with this camera, you can do it in 2020 with the technology that we all have available.